Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Well, howdy folks, and welcome to this video about a rather somber but still very important and interesting topic, shaming in gaming. Now, I'm not talking about the pile of shame. I've made a video on that before. I'm talking about the negative stigma that surrounds hobbies like video games, role-playing games, and of course, tabletop games. Now, I stumbled across the idea the other day when I was watching, or rather listening to YouTube. I was painting stuff, of course, and I came across this video from Mini Wargaming, where Mini Wargamer Dave interviewed Stephen Box of Vanguard Tactics. Now, the video was titled, Overcoming the Shame of Playing Warhammer. Now, the video wasn't exactly what the title implied. As a child, Box was bullied as a kid, and playing Warhammer was just another log on the fire. They were already bullying him, and when they found out he played Warhammer, that just gave him something else to bully him about. It wasn't that playing Warhammer brought him into being a target of bullying. Now, that might be splitting hairs here, so yeah, that's neither here nor there. But the point is, watching that video reminded me to think about this idea that there is still a social stigma to playing tabletop war games, at least as an adult. Now, I've been playing board games, video games, role-playing games, and tabletop games for pretty much my entire life, so I'm well aware of the looks that you get from people when you tell them you're into those kinds of hobbies. I understand it completely. What surprises me, though, is that this concept of shame for gaming still exists well into the 21st century. I mean, come on, folks. Given the things that society is beginning to embrace or accept, given the things we're being told we shouldn't shame people about, and given the success that a lot of the nerdy things that came out of gaming have now become massive parts of popular culture, huge successes in Hollywood films, big lines of merchandise, all from these things that society still shames people for participating in. So I was really curious. Where did it all start, and why does it still exist?
Very interesting.
So where did it all start? Well, what I think is we need to go back to the 1980s and the era of the Satanic Panic. In 1979, a college student who frequently played Dungeons & Dragons went into a depression and turned in his own character sheet, if you know what I mean. Now, this young man had a history of depression and drug use, but rather than focus on that as the reason and motivation behind his self-cancellation, his mother said that obviously it was because Dungeons & Dragons. Clearly. Nothing else factored, just that. Well, that accusation let the genie out of the bottle. And instead of the parents taking responsibility for failing to address their child's other needs, it was a lot easier just to blame something else. Because of that event, Dungeons & Dragons, both the game and the players, became targets in a new witch hunt. Unsubstantiated accusations flew, and while it began in the evangelical Christian community, it wasn't long before media giants like Oprah and 60 Minutes decided to pick up on it and run shows and special exposés and episodes addressing the quote-unquote satanic threat. I was not immune to it. One day I recall, as a child, my mother calling me and my brothers into the kitchen and telling us that she'd seen an episode of Oprah, and because of that, she was making us throw out all of our D&D stuff. And she stood there with the garbage can in front of her open and watched us put in books, dice, character sheets, everything, and then right then and there took it out to the garbage to make sure we didn't dig back in it and try and get all that stuff out. There was close to $100 worth of stuff, and while that doesn't sound like a lot today, back in the 1980s, for kids and teenagers to have $100, that was something. But we got to stare at it as it all went right into the trash. Now, Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons & Dragons, even went on the 60 Minutes interview as their opposing viewpoint, and his rebuttal was fantastic. He said playing D&D no more affects your mental state than playing Monopoly affects your financial state.
This is make-believe, and nobody's murdered, and there's no violence there. I mean, to use an analogy with another game, who is bankrupted by losing a game of Monopoly? Nobody is, because the money is make-believe, the property is make-believe, and the bankruptcy is make-believe.
The places where youth behavior was overlapping with D&D and leading to some bad outcomes were also individuals that had serious mental problems before they started playing D&D. But it was so much easier just to blame this new thing. Now, the ironic thing is that as a result of the Satanic Panic, it served as free advertising, and Dungeons & Dragons sales doubled in a single year. What's more ironic, but also tragic, is that today, parents want their kids to spend less time on screens, yet wargaming, role-playing games are great alternatives to screen time. But in part because of that Satanic Panic, they're not seen as worthy alternatives. So the solution was there, we just as a society decided to torpedo it. Now, even after the panic died out, the damage was done. Dungeons & Dragons had a stigma associated with it. Back then, most of the players were the really nerdy kids, like myself, who were a little bit socially awkward, and typically not the super handsome, strapping young folks that attracted the other sex. On top of that, add to the fact that many of these kids, because of their social awkwardness, were kind of social outcasts. And it served as a way for those kids who had those kind of social shortcomings to find friends, to find a community, to find a group that they could do things together. But from the outside looking in, it looked very, very different. And these kids who are interested in Dungeons & Dragons also tend to be folks that are interested in other nerdy kinds of hobbies like board games, war games, collecting Funko Pop, anime, all that kind of stuff. But what happened, I think, is that the stigma over Dungeons & Dragons, the idea of fantasy worlds, playing games in those fantasy worlds, using your imagination, which apparently we're encouraged to do unless it's in those kinds of settings. But anyways, the stigma of D&D transferred over into all of those other hobbies. I mean, look at this guy. This is a model from Games Workshop's early days in the 1980s at the height of the Satanic Panic. What do you think folks would think if they saw this model in their kid's room? And society, from the outside looking in, looked at these nerdy hobbies and said it was the place where dorks, wimps, and other kids went because they couldn't play sports, they couldn't work with their hands, and they couldn't get a girlfriend. Now, that was back in the 1980s, and maybe there was a bit of truth to some of it, but that was 40 years ago. Surely, that stigma is not still hanging around. In some respects, it actually has gone away. Fantasy and sci-fi have become accepted genres in society. Just look at the success of things like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. People aren't afraid to admit that they have read all the Harry Potter books 6 or 7 times. Adults can go to Harry Potter World and not be ashamed of that at all. So as a whole, the concept of fantasy worlds, of make-believe, of enjoying those things as an adult have gone away. But what about the other elements of the stigma? Is there still shame in other nerdy hobbies? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. While society has become okay with the general idea of fantasy and sci-fi, it seems there's only certain outlets for expressing that interest in fantasy and sci-fi that are acceptable. For example, a recent poll of hundreds of American women asked them what hobbies and interests they found attractive or unattractive when looking for men to date or possibly marry. These women were asked to rank 75 different hobbies on a simple binary scale. They were shown the hobby and they said it's either attractive or unattractive. So keep that in mind. It's all or none. Now, wargaming was not specifically on the list. However, the list included comic books, cosplay, Magic the Gathering, anime, Funko Pop. Those might not be wargaming, but I would definitely say they are wargaming adjacent. I don't know too many wargamers that don't dabble in at least one of those other hobbies. And here's the real kicker. 2 of the most attractive hobbies were reading and painting. No joke. Now, I imagine that when the poll participants think of reading, they're thinking of great literature and poetry, or books on how to make women happy. And for painting, they probably meant canvas painting. But what if I'm reading sci-fi or fantasy, set in a wargaming world? Does that put it up with reading and one of the top hobbies, or does that pull it down with comic books, which are reading, folks? Now, I know what most likely these women would say. I'm just trying to point out the double standard here. And as for painting, I will go toe-to-toe with anyone who wants to argue that painting miniatures is a lesser form of painting and artwork. If you're honestly going to tell me that this is superior to this just because it's on canvas, then I don't need to talk to you anymore because you're a moron. But let's continue. We see other examples of this stigma and shame still persisting. In 2018, The Graham Norton Show, a celebrity interview show in the UK, interviewed Alicia Vikander about her upcoming role as Lara Croft in the new release of Tomb Raider. During that interview, Vikander mentioned that growing up, she was the only girl in her circle of friends that played video games, and as a result, she felt embarrassed about it.
I also grew up in a time where there was none of my girlfriends who played video games, and I kind of kept it, I was kind of ashamed of doing it.
Now, that's when she was a child, and social acceptance, the attitude of your peers, that's very, very important, and kids will pretend to believe and support things they don't just to maintain that kind of acceptance by the group. But she's an adult. She wouldn't do that, right? Well, think about this. Norton turned to another guest on that same show and asked if he played video games, and this was his answer.
You're a big gamer. Do you play a lot of games?
Nah, because it ruins my life. it just ruins my... I've got things to do, man.
Now, to be fair, he didn't specify whether he meant that he enjoyed them too much and was worried he would overindulge, so he just gave it up entirely, or whether he just saw video games as a waste of time a priori. But what's more interesting is after he made that statement, Vikander immediately jumped back into the conversation to say this.
That's such a good answer. I kind of realized that now when I did it, because I did play the games before I did the film, and I was like, wow, I had way too much time when I was a child.
Now, ain't that something? After talking about playing the starring role in a movie about a game she played as a kid, which in a way would help prepare her for the role, she immediately expresses regret over playing it once a peer expresses a shameful sentiment. Now, the video I pulled these clips from was actually a compilation of Norton interviewing celebrities who had upcoming roles in movies based on games. And it didn't really surprise me that like 90% of the actors didn't play video games. Many of them didn't even know that their role was based on a video game until they were well into production. But what I found interesting and a little bit irritating is this paradox that these interviews put on display. Playing video games was seen as shameful, but it's totally okay for Hollywood to take that game IP and make billions with it. What's that all about? If a grown man creates a character in D&D and goes adventuring and questing, he's some kind of man-child. But if a different grown man takes on an acting role and pretends to be a knight or character who goes questing, well, that's not only okay, that's super attractive. Bollocks. I am calling total hypocrisy on this one. But that's talking about video games. What about tabletop games? Because after all, that was kind of the focus of this video, and this is a tabletop gaming channel. Well, let's go back to another episode in The Graham Norton Show where Henry Cavill is one of the guests. And in this video, he tries to explain Warhammer to Graham Norton. Take a look.
World of Warcraft.
Warhammer.
Warhammer, I'm a fool. So what, so you paint by hand?
Yes, yeah.
When you paint them, what do you do with them then, Henry?
Then you put them together in little armies and you fight against someone else's army.
Now, after admitting that he's totally ignorant of the hobby and asking a few questions probably for the sake of the show, Norton makes what I think is a parting and dismissive shot about the whole thing.
But it is fun.
Yeah, no, toys, very good fun.
It's just toys. He really couldn't understand it, but that's okay because it's juvenile, it's beneath him, it's something not really worth understanding anyway. Although, I will give mad props to Tom Holland for what he said.
Can I come over and play? You can. Absolutely. It sounds amazing.
Now, from here on, I'm going to focus the video primarily on tabletop games because, as I said, this is a gaming channel, and trying to cover it all is just too big. But many of the things I talk about here, I think are just as applicable to video games, role-playing games, and other kinds of nerdy gaming hobbies. So let's get into it a bit more. I think the first issue is actually a deficiency on the part of us, the gamers. Come on, guys and gals. We can't blame them for everything. In that clip where Cavill tries to explain Warhammer, he really doesn't do a very good job. I think one reason gaming still carries a stigma is because we as gamers don't present it very well. When you describe it like this...
Then you put them together in little armies and you fight against someone else's army.
That kind of feeds into the stereotype of it being simplistic and childless because that's how you're describing it. Think of this. If you tried to explain soccer to someone who was totally unfamiliar with it, and your description was, you kick a ball and put it between two poles. That sounds about as exciting as this.
Toss the ball, catch it in the cup, dump it out of the cup, toss it, and catch it in the cup again.
Ball in a cup, it's a ball in a cup.
If the hobby and hobbyists are accused of acting childish and we can't describe it in any other way, then what else is the rest of society going to think? That's why when I describe wargaming to someone who's never heard of it before, start with something that captures the essence of the game, but also brings in a little bit of high culture. I ask them, do you play chess? This is kind of like chess. You have an army, your opponent has an army. There's rules that govern how the pieces move around a board, and we try and outwit each other by using our pieces to achieve an objective. By starting the conversation with an appeal to something like chess, which has wide social acceptance, and in fact, people who play chess are seen as being intelligent, cultured, the kind of folks who, sip a triple decaf latte while working on Mac products wearing a beret in a Barnes & Noble. I might be going a bit too far, but you get the basic idea. Then, after establishing something like chess as the foundation, now I move into what the game's actually about, or more about. I tell them, imagine playing chess where you can customize your side of the board. You can get rid of the rooks, knights, and bishops, but have 2 queens. Or you could get rid of your queen and replace it with 3 more rows of pawns. Now, after that, if the person I'm talking to is still engaged and interested, then I can bring up how you see different themed chess sets? You'll see one for the Civil War. You'll see one for Batman. Heck, I've seen a Simpsons chess set. So I tell them, imagine, not only can you build your chess army to be whatever pieces you want, but you can then design the pieces to have whatever aesthetic theme you want. To me, that sounds a heck of a lot better way to describe miniature wargaming than to say, I play war with little toy soldiers. The next reason why I think wargaming gets shamed is that it's seen as a waste of time and resources. Heck, that video that we watched where Alicia Vikander was talking about her role in Tomb Raider regretted spending so much time as a child playing video games. And if playing them as a child was seen as a waste, well boy, what does that say about people who play them as an adult? Now, I'd like to start with a couple personal anecdotes here because I have a sneaking suspicion that as you guys listen to this, everyone listening will be reminded of a similar experience they've had. When I was first married, and I didn't have a kingdom, I would build and paint my models at the kitchen table, right in the middle of the main floor. Twice, people came over when I had left stuff out on the table. One woman, who barely knew me at all, looked at the models, then looked at me and with this motherly expression said, well, I sincerely hope this means that you've done all the yard work, schoolwork, and have put in some volunteer hours if you have time to do something like this. And I was very, very tempted to look at her and be like, suck my what? Another time, my former brother-in-law came over, looked at my stuff, and said, boy, you must have a lot of extra money lying around. On the one hand, well played, good sir. But on the other hand, this was a guy who owned a boat and 2 quad runners. So don't talk to me about spending money on leisure. I'll bet that the purchase, gas, insurance, storage, and maintenance of one of those quad runners is more than I spent on wargaming in my entire life. And then if we throw in the boat, the other quad runner, the trailer to tow them, the truck he needed to buy to pull the trailer, well, you get the point which one of us is spending more money on leisure activities. To me, this critique of it wasting time is sheer hypocrisy and nonsense. It's not that you're wasting time. What they're really saying is, well, I wouldn't spend your time and money this way, so you shouldn't do it either. I'll bet just about everyone out there has a hobby or interest that someone else considers a complete waste of time. Me, personally, I hate watching sports. I've tried so hard. I've watched the World Series, the Super Bowl, the World Cup, the Stanley Cup. I found it all boring. I just don't get it. But that doesn't mean I go around telling other people they shouldn't watch those sports. If they like it, they like it. What's the big deal? Yet when I see people watching the Super Bowl and think, you guys are wasting your time, well, that's how they feel when they walk into a hobby store and see a bunch of grown men standing over a table filled with miniatures and throwing dice. The only difference is that one activity, or rather I should say watching one activity, is seen as socially acceptable, while the other one isn't. I even recently got into a bit of a discussion, didn't become an argument, but it could have, where someone was trying to tell me that watching someone play a video game on Twitch is totally different than watching a professional sports team on television. And what's interesting is their argument was not what the viewer was doing, but what the person on the screen was doing. My argument was, what is the difference between people sitting in a chair watching someone play a game on a screen? That was my argument. Theirs was, well, those men are athletes and this other kid's just playing a game. And I thought, that's very interesting. You're shifting to what they're doing, not what you're doing. Now, fortunately, I think some of the stigma will simply disappear over time. Because as Hollywood makes a movie, a television show, something like that, and people get really interested in it, and they say, this is great, and then they find out, oh, this is based on a video game, that kind of forces them to say, well, all right, well, the video game has a great story. Look at Fallout, for example. Great game, decent series on Amazon. If someone's never played the game and they think video games are stupid, yet they really enjoy the show, they might go, well, wait a sec, you're telling me game creators can create worlds with great stories and characters that I'm interested in? Maybe it's not so bad after all. Or at least that's what they should think. Whether or not they do, that's a different story. Or if we take a look at the recent Amazon series Secret Level, that had a Warhammer episode, and it introduced the world to the 40K universe in a much better way than saying, I fight wars with little plastic men. So if someone were to see some guys playing Warhammer 40K, they might think, how childish. But then they go back home, they watch Secret Level, and they're like, wow, that looks really cool. They might suddenly realize, oh, I wouldn't have the one without the other. So honestly, I think it's just a matter of time, at least for this part of the stigma. Poker used to be a saloon game. Now we have a World Series of poker and professional card players that are highly respected for their talents and make tons and tons of money. Comic books used to be just for kids, but now they're much more accepted as an artistic form of storytelling. Heck, there are even college textbooks that have been adapted into comic book format as a way of engaging students, and these are sold at four-year schools with prestigious reputations. It's also very helpful that big celebrities start talking about playing war games, especially ones like Henry Cavill and Vin Diesel, who don't necessarily fit the stereotype of the goofy-looking nerdy kid who weighs 90 pounds soaking wet and couldn't get a girlfriend if he tried. Then you have other celebrities like Robin Williams and the creators of South Park, or even Peter Cushing. All of these people played war games. It seems curious that the artistic impulse which makes someone a good actor or writer connects to the artistic impulse to build and play games in a wargaming universe. Funny that, ain't it? So now where do we go from here? I think two things are finally going to end game shaming, and we've pretty much already talked about them. Time, and pointing out the hypocrisy when it pops up. So let's kind of end where I began. I mentioned when the Satanic Panic hit in the 1980s, my brothers and I were forced to throw away all of our D&D stuff. Well, let's fast forward about a decade or so. I was 16, 17, junior or senior in high school. My brothers and I decided we wanted to start playing Dungeons & Dragons again. And we figured that since we were a lot older, a lot of time had passed, and we hadn't done anything really dramatic like the folks in the 1980s were accusing us of, that our parents might be a little more okay with us returning to Dungeons & Dragons. So we bought a starter set, and we were at the dining room table playing an adventure, and my mother walked in the door and gave us a look once she realized what we were doing. Oh my, I haven't seen a look like that on her face in quite some time. It was this look of betrayal. It was this look of anger. It was this look of we were defying her and she was going to stand up to it. I mean, it got pretty bad. And she told us, "Is that what I think it is?" And we looked at her and said, "Yes." And she just turned and walked away. And then later that evening, we got another earful. We got Satanic Panic of the 80s, Part 2. Now, as I said, I was a teenager by this point. Teenagers are more rebellious by nature and have started to be more comfortable disagreeing and arguing with parents. As a kid, when she said throw the stuff away, we threw it away. This time when she said throw the stuff away, I just couldn't because it was so dumb. So I did something that is one of the highlights of my existence. I went through the house. I gathered every book, toy, movie, picture, anything in the house that had any kind of relation to wizards, magic, knights, monsters, sword fighting, all of it. And I put it in a giant box. And I said, if you throw away our D&D, I'm throwing away all of this stuff because it's all the same. It's fantasy, it's imagination, it's sword and sorcery. And if D&D is going to lead us to Satan worship, so will watching this movie that you love so much. My parents actually went pretty silent after that one, and after a day or two, they actually came back to us and said, okay, you can keep it, but we're going to keep a close eye on you, and if you start acting up, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, all right, save face, I get it, you got to do that as parents. But calling out the hypocrisy worked. And as I said, that was something. I wasn't expecting it. I figured we'd just be going down in flames with the ship, but it worked. So call out the hypocrisy when it pops up, but do so in a manner equal to the level of the person. If you don't know them, don't be so combative. I was speaking to family. But if you're talking to someone on the street that's challenging nerdy gaming, I bet if you talk to them long enough, you'll find they're involved in a hobby that's similar in some respect. Now, another reason why I think the stigma is going to go away over time is that the kids of the 1980s, especially today in the 2020s, they're the adults now. And the guys like me, who are nerdy, socially awkward, and not exactly the most handsome of guys, played this game for my whole life, but still managed to build a career, get married and have a family, be a productive citizen, and be a normal person. It's a little harder to keep applying the stigma that video games are only for specific kinds of social outcasts and nerdy people and so on and so forth. The old guard of culture is being replaced by the new guard, and the new guard are gamers. And when the new guard produce shows like Stranger Things and reintroduce gaming and hobbying to the public, it's now more acceptable because it's the fans presenting it to the world rather than the enemies presenting it to the world. So what do you think? Do you have similar stories? Do you have a suggestion for how to speed up this process of erasing any kind of shame or stigma associated with gaming, whether it be video games, tabletop games, or any other kind of gaming? Put it down in the comments. And until next time, keep your dice on the table.